When you really look across the foundational sources of civilization, the big ideas, one concept just emerges as the ultimate measuring stick for any human society.
Hmm.
And that concept is justice. Today, we are launching into a foundational analysis of the essay on justice. It's one of those cornerstone ideas that really it measures the difference between a flourishing community and one that's just descending into chaos.
And for you, the learner, this is so central. It's the core moral and political idea. It really dictates the answers to three essential questions for any society.
Okay, what are they?
Well, first, how do people and communities make sure everyone gets what they're due? Second, how is power limited by right, so it's not just pure force?
And the third?
And third, how do we successfully order and balance those competing demands for liberty and equality to actually achieve a common good that works?
And as we synthesize centuries of thought on this, from Plato all the way to the present, we should probably pause right here. We need to mention the unique way we're doing this.
Right.
You are experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation powered by Google's Notebook LM. It's what allows us to perform a deeper, more dynamic essay analysis because we can process and synthesize this huge volume of really dense material so quickly.
That synthesis is just crucial here, because the concept of justice, it seems intuitive, but it is extremely hard to define with any kind of precision.
So what's the core definition we're working with?
In the tradition we are exploring, justice is defined as the supreme practical standard. It's the standard by which any society has to arrange its whole system of rights, duties, rewards, and punishments.
And the goal is what?
The goal is pretty straightforward on the surface,
Mm-hmm.
making sure that each person in each group has what is due, and that this whole arrangement respects human dignity above all else.
That sounds like a moral compass, which makes sense. But here's the really counterintuitive insight from the source material, specifically from Mortimer Adler's approach.
This is a big one.
He treats justice as an unlimited good. Just think about that for a moment. Most goods, money, time, even something like liberty can be had in excess or they're finite. But this analysis says you cannot have too much justice.
It's the ultimate metric. I mean, look at other political goods. Take liberty or equality. They can easily become destructive forces if you pursue them without any measure.
Oh, so?
Well, unregulated liberty just becomes license,
Yeah.
right? It lets the strong oppress the weak. And if you enforce equality too far, you can crush legitimate differences, individual excellence. Justice, in this view, is the higher measure that calibrates both of those.
That placement, putting it sort of outside the spectrum of goods that need to be limited, that immediately elevates the whole conversation.
It does.
It forces us to ask, okay, where does this universal standard even come from? And that takes us right to the foundational classical debate.
Between Plato and Aristotle.
Yeah.
Precisely. Let's start with Plato's view in the Republic. For him, justice is, first and foremost, a kind of spiritual and structural harmony. It starts in the soul.
In the soul, with reason ruling over the appetites and emotions.
Yes. And then that internal harmony is mirrored in the city. A just city means every part is doing its proper job without getting in the way of the others.
It's like a symphony orchestra, right? Justice isn't just the violins playing well, it's every instrument playing its part at the right time under the conductor. That's the Platonic city. Workers, soldiers, and philosopher rulers all staying in their own lane.
That's an excellent analogy. It really highlights the normative vision. Plato's view reflects an eternal moral order. So justice isn't defined by shifting public opinion or what the majority wants.
It's defined by a higher rational truth.
Exactly. And the practical implication is profound. You need philosopher rulers, the ones who can actually grasp the truth of the good, to govern. Power has to submit to knowledge.
But then Aristotle comes along, and he doesn't just throw Plato out, but he shifts the focus so dramatically.
Right. He does. He moves from that eternal form down to the practical life of the polis, the city-state. He's basically saying, look, we need to see how justice actually works in the messy reality of human life.
So he defines it as more of a practical virtue.
A practical virtue that regulates our dealings with other people through lawful order and proportionate distribution. His focus is on achieving the human purpose, the philos, which is living well in a community.
But wait a second. If Aristotle is focused on the polis and its existing laws, doesn't that risk making justice just relative to whatever the laws are in that specific place, not universal?
That's the key challenge, and it's a great question. He avoids total relativism by embedding justice in what he sees as natural virtues, things like fairness, proportionality, that he believed human reason could figure out. but his lasting contribution is breaking justice down into concrete types that we still use today.
And these are essential. I mean, this is how government functions. You've got distributive justice,
Mm-hmm.
which is about the fair allocation of resources, honors, maybe burdens. So things like the tax code or how we fund public schools, that's all distributive.
And then you have corrective justice. This is for rectifying wrongs.
Yeah.
If a wrong is committed, a theft, a broken contract, an injury, corrective justice tries to restore the balance through penalties or compensation.
So the civil lawsuit, the traffic ticket, the criminal trial.
All of that. So later thinkers are basically left with this big tension. Do we follow Plato and stress a timeless law that's above any state? Or do we follow Aristotle and try to refine the practical procedural systems we actually have?
And that tension, it just screams for a synthesizer, a grand harmonizer.
Which leads us directly into the medieval period, specifically to Augustine and Thomas Aquinas. They took those classical insights, natural justice, what reason can discern, and they grounded them in a theological framework.
So they reinterpreted justice as both a cardinal human virtue and a participation in divine law.
Exactly. By making human law subject to natural law, which in turn reflects eternal law, they gave human rights and duties a transcendent, universal backing, one that even the most powerful king couldn't just ignore.
And that dual grounding seems like a necessary step to get to the early modern period, where the focus just shifts dramatically again.
It really does. Instead of centering the whole discussion on duty and virtue, thinkers start to emphasize individual inherent rights, consent of the governed, constitutionalism.
This shift, I mean, it's largely driven by the Enlightenment, and it completely reframes what a legitimate government has to be. Justice moves from being this ideal the government hopes for to a basic requirement it must fulfill.
And what's that requirement?
Specifically, securing the individual's rights, life, liberty, property through limited accountable powers.
Precisely. Modern democratic constitutions, bills of rights, they're essentially codified statements of corrective and distributive justice. They frame the government by what it cannot do to you and what it must provide, like due process.
Which brings us right back to that calibration challenge. If justice measures and limits liberty and equality, how does that actually work in the real world?
The source material is very clear on this. Justice is the boundary line. Think about the current debate over economic structures. If you grant unlimited economic liberty, you risk huge inequality, even systemic oppression, where the weak have no recourse.
But on the other side,
if you try to force a total rigid equality, you crush legitimate differences in merit, effort, and talent.
so justice is the principle that says people should enjoy as much freedom and equality as justice allows. It's like this dynamic ethical scale, always moving to maintain moral balance.
And that balancing act immediately confronts us with the ultimate practical conflict, the one that's plagued philosophy forever, the might versus right debate.
Is justice just the advantage of the powerful, like the ancient sophists argued? Or does power have to answer to some independent moral standard?
I mean, this question tests the very foundation of whether we live in a civil society or just a well-organized gang.
You see it playing out today, right? When a corporate lobbyist writes the regulations for their own industry, or when a ruler exempts themselves from the laws everyone else has to follow.
That is the might versus right debate in real time.
Yeah.
It asks if law is just a tool of power or a rational measure that binds everyone, rulers and the ruled alike.
Okay, so to get a handle on this huge field, we should probably lay out the four major kinds of justice that the sources say operate everywhere.
Let's do it. First, we have distributive justice. That's shares and burdens, taxes, welfare, public honors. Second is corrective justice, which is about redressing specific wrongs, ensuring accountability.
And third, the one that's often overlooked, is procedural justice. This is about fair processes, the right to an unbiased hearing, due process.
Yes. And fourth is social or political justice. This looks at the big picture. Is the entire structure of our institutions designed fairly? And this applies at multiple levels too. Personal, institutional, and even international war, peace, empire.
Now, before we look at how to move from just having information to actually gaining wisdom on this is probably a good moment for a quick note. For you, our dedicated listener, Mindful Moments is our YouTube channel. We offer AI essay analysis, summaries, and critiques, all to inspire reflection and rational thought. So now, let's get back to the core operational principle of justice.
Which is reciprocity.
The golden rule.
It's the golden rule made concrete. Treat others as you would rationally consent to be treated, assuming everyone shares an equal moral status. This isn't just a nice little saying. It's the most reliable, practical test for injustice
How so?
because it instantly exposes systematic unfairness. If rules are applied selectively, if the powerful get to exempt themselves from the rules they impose on others, or if institutions just systematically burden people who don't have a voice,
Then the system fails the reciprocity test?
it fails completely. It's a system designed for the few, not the many. And this standard is woven into our public life. Look at constitutional goals. Form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility.
Promote the general welfare, secure the blessings of liberty.
Every single one of those requires constant calibration based on some definition of justice.
Because you can't get security without risking tyranny. You can't promote welfare without risking dependency. These aren't technical problems.
No, they're ethical ones. These trade-offs are resolved by appealing to a substantive account of justice. What is the right balance?
Which finally brings us to the path to wisdom, and this is essential for you, the learner. The Great Ideas tradition identifies 4 levels of engagement with an idea like justice. Most of us start at the level of opinion.
That's where most political debates happen. It's just the contested views about what's fair in a specific case. Is that salary fair? Is that punishment too harsh? It's often shaped by culture or ideology.
Then, moving past just opinion, we get to knowledge.
Right. Here you get stable criteria, the legal codes, ethical theories, rights doctrines. You might know the law, but you don't necessarily understand why the law is the way it is.
Which is the next level, understanding.
This is about connecting the dots, integrating knowledge of virtue, civic structures, moral law into one coherent story. It's knowing why due process is essential to liberty, not just that the Fifth Amendment requires it.
And finally,
You reach wisdom. Wisdom is applying all of that in the hardest cases, the gray areas, where goods conflict, where the law itself might be unjust. Wisdom aims for moral integrity and the common good at the same time. It's the judicious application of principle and reality.
so if you're trying to build a serious theory of justice, it has to pass some tough tests. Logically, it has to define its terms clearly, right? Merit, need, and it has to be internally coherent.
And beyond logic, it must pass 3 truth tests against the real world. First, correspondence with social and psychological realities. Second, coherence with other accepted moral truths. And third, and maybe most pragmatically, it has to succeed in fostering peace, trust, and flourishing.
Meaning if your just theory consistently leads to riots and distrust, it fails the pragmatic test.
It fails. And yet, the great conversation on this remains stubbornly open. Why? Because these abstract principles are constantly being tested by concrete, persistent conflicts: economic inequality, systemic injustice, war, technological surveillance.
The core disputes just endure. Is justice about following strict rules or getting the best results? Should we focus on rewarding what people deserve or meeting their needs?
Individual rights or social cohesion. These tensions make sure that justice can never be solved and just sealed away in a neat little package.
So the ultimate measure of success for engaging with this idea isn't about theoretical elegance. It's about whether we, as citizens, become more capable of treating people as ends in themselves, limiting power, and sustaining a decent, durable common life.
The application is everything. Learning about justice has to move you from just gathering information to preparing for wise action.
So since this conversation does remain open, and given that justice is this unlimited good, here's a thought for you to mull over. As rapid technological change creates vast new capabilities and risks, from AI regulation to genetic editing, how should one use the measure of justice to weigh the competing demands of individual fundamental rights versus the collective needs of humanity? Click the link on screen for the in-depth essay summary, subscribe, share, purchase via link, and think rationally. See the many genre-based essay podcasts at Mindful Moments. Nourish your mind on the go.